Hey, this is 94.3 Radio 1, One World, your station. Joining us is Antoinette Lattouf. She's an Australian-Lebanese multi-award-winning broadcaster, columnist, author, diversity advocate, mental health, ambassador, and let me add, mother of two. Now, that is impressive. That is impressive. What's the on-trend word to use these days? Multi-hyphenate.
I think that's what I am, or somebody who does too much and sleeps too little.
Yes, that too. Welcome. Thank you so much for connecting with us today.
Thank you.
So much to talk about, Antoinette. Firstly, will this be your first visit to India?
It is. I'm so excited. It's something I've wanted to do. It's a country I've wanted to visit. So I'm so thrilled to be coming to Mumbai. And I believe Tata Live is the country's largest literary festival. So I'm super honored to have been invited.
Yep. There's so many, I think a lot of the population love their books. You'd be happy to know. But let's come to the Indian Broadcasting Network and channels. They showcase a very different brand of television. I'm not sure whether you've seen any, but so if you had to describe your style, though, of journalism or reporting, what would that be, Antoinette?
I guess I've always been interested in telling stories and amplifying voices that are either ignored by the mainstream, simplified, or in some cases only ever covered in a hostile way or one that is with moral panic. And so what I try and do with my journalism is to try and bridge those divides, not by being some kind of PR agent for ethnic minorities or people of color, but simply to allow communities who are often spoken about to actually speak for themselves, for them to share their experiences and insights and to tell stories in a way that includes rather than excludes them.
Right. So then, finding your voice as a Lebanese Australian, was that challenging at in the start? How did you assert yourself in Australian media?
Yeah, absolutely was. When I entered journalism school, I remember asking my careers advisor for some advice on how to get into the best journalism school in Sydney. And I grew up in a very working class area. I went to a public school. And my family, growing up, I didn't know anybody who'd finished school, primary school, let alone high school, let alone had gone to university. And so I remember speaking to the careers advisor and saying, I want to go to the best journalism school in the state. And I identified the one I wanted to go to. And I was told, oh, maybe I should aim lower. And maybe I should instead seek to go to like a local community college instead. And so from the very outset, I guess having a career in the media wasn't something that was encouraged or seen possible for someone from a Lebanese background. And when I joined commercial television, I actually became the first Australian-Lebanese person on commercial television. And this is just, despite the fact that Australia has a very multicultural it's a very multicultural country, hugely multicultural population. We just don't see ethnic minorities like myself or Indians, for example. In 5 years, India will become the most common place of birth in Australia outside of the country, overtaking England. And the latest Australian population census data revealed that Hinduism is the fastest growing religion in Australia. Yet despite this, we don't see people of Arabic-speaking backgrounds or of Indian backgrounds hold prominent positions on air, in media, or even in politics. And so that's something that really frustrated me. And that's why I was even more determined, irrespective of the barriers and being told to aim lower or look elsewhere. I was super determined to gain entry into one of those institutions of power. And that is what the media is. It is an institution of power.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm guessing all of that kind of, influenced you to co-found Media Diversity Australia. I just caught one of your recent TEDx talks where you talk about D&I allergy, diversity, inclusion, allergy. So what's the remedy for that when you enter like a boardroom filled, where you find no representation?
Yeah, and so just so the listeners can catch up, I talk about diversity and inclusion allergy because in an Australian context, actually, in a lot, I don't know what the case is in India, but there has generally been, a movement towards, at the very least, discussing the need for, more gender equity, whether it's in boardrooms or in government, and then other forms of diversity, including culture, disability, socioeconomic. They're all factors of diversity and inclusion. In Australia in particular, there is quite a bit of pushback, sometimes overtly, sometimes covertly, to the mere suggestion that we need better representation. In many ways, people still believe, oh, the best person gets the job. And the fact that that best person is often the same type of person, usually in Australia, usually white, usually male, usually middle class, usually privately educated, usually knows somebody within the institution. Yet there is still this entrenched belief that they are the best person for the job. And not that they're privileged, or not that there's unconscious bias in the hiring process, or not that it is because of who they know rather than what they know. And so in response to discussions about the need for targets or quotas, I joke about D&I allergies, where people just are completely allergic to the fact that institutions need to be more equitable. And to ensure that happens, you need proactive strategies. Yeah. You need to rethink the recruitment process. Yeah. You need to perhaps consider things like targets or quotas. You need training for middle managers. You need to completely rethink the way in which your institution operates. Because not only is it the right thing to do for social cohesion and representation, there's mountains and mountains of research that shows it's the business smart thing to do, because diverse organizations outperform less diverse ones.
Well, I have to agree there. Personally, as a news junkie, I didn't realize how much of the other side of the story I was not getting or was not being told. Besides the Indian news, of course, there was BBC and CNN and just that. And then I happened upon, say, Al Jazeera, and my, perceptions changed so radically. If you had to start, for example, a Lebanese Australian channel, would that be an option?
Well, some people have asked that. Some people have said, what about creating a website or content, even if it's in the English language, for diverse people? And that tells more diverse stories. And in some ways in Australia, we have one of our public broadcasters, SBS, which by its very charter was created to ensure that in-language programs are available in radio. And actually just last year, they launched a 24-hour Arabic-speaking news channel. I have mixed views about that, because in some ways that others and continues to minoritize what is part of, we'll soon be a majority minority country, and I don't think we can now should be relegated to our own channels or our own in-language programs. It's much more impactful when in terms of the inclusion part, when you're part of the mainstream, you're amplified in the mainstream, your stories are told or your perspectives are shared on all topics, not just topics relating to your language or to your faith, but as you and I would know, we all have bills to pay. We all have mental health issues. We all vote. We're part of the democratic process. So I'm much more interested in normalizing the voices and perspectives and elevating people like myself and yourself into positions of power in mainstream media, because then that's when you start to see shifts in power. I think if we push us all over to an in-language program or a content only for people like us, I think in many ways that can continue to fuel division and misunderstanding rather than build bridges.
Fair enough. Well, coming to the Tata Lit Fest, you're going to be chatting about your first book. It's called How to Lose Friends and Influence White People. I'm told it's a witty and anti-racism guide. It's an exploration of the modern manifestations of systemic racism in a country like Australia. Can you give us a few examples from the book?
Oh, a few examples of systemic racism, or a few of the how-to tips?
I think let's go with the how-to. I think like hacks.
Yeah, sure. I guess one of the two kind of important takeaways I often leave people with, irrespective of who they are or what they're trying to achieve, when it comes to championing anti-racism, and we all have a role to play because we are all kind of grappling with ingrained anti-black racism. We live in a society, especially in colonial countries like India and Australia, where whiteness was seen as supreme and pure, and everything else was relative. And then at the very bottom is, for in Australia in particular, Indigenous communities. And so people of colour like myself, who sit somewhere in the middle, many are tempted to buy into the kind of the white supremacist thinking rather than actively use their voice to be anti-racist. So my two tips would be, understand that we all have biases and that we can all be racist, and that just because you are a person of colour, it doesn't make you exempt from racism. There's racism within cultural groups. There's anti-blackness within all of us because it is ingrained in our institutions, in our popular culture, in our music. So many things that we have been exposed to continue to amplify and position white as best. And so I think we all need to have an honest conversation with ourselves. And step one is accept that we all need to be anti-racist and that it is an ongoing journey. That's going to take a lot of work. Secondly, I talk about having a niche because it can be really overwhelming when you think about systemic racism. And I know in India, for example, when you think about racism connected to either colonial thinking or the caste system, so much of it is so overwhelming and in so many institutions, and you think, oh gosh, what can I do as an individual to come against something that is such a global problem? And that's why I talk about the importance of finding a niche. Find something that you want to put your energy, your time, your resources towards. So for me, I focus on challenging lack of representation in the media, because I think that plays a really big role in perpetuating racial divides rather than bridging divides. So there are so many other things I could be doing. I could be looking at, Black deaths in custody. I could be looking at different health outcomes for minority groups. There are so many ways that racism manifests and has real world impacts. But for me, I've chosen a niche because you're more effective if you focus. And so if your passion is for equity on the sporting field, or something through education, or something through health, I think it's that, if that is what you want to do, find organizations that you can support, whether it's financial, volunteer your time. And the only other tip I would put out there is do your research, get educated. There's so many great thinkers, and I know in India, the United States, Australia, the UK, there are so many great thinkers. There's so much research done in this area. Read. If reading's not your thing, listen to podcasts, watch movies, go along to literary festivals, get invested, to be challenged, to do the work. There's so many resources even on Google, and so I think it's important to acknowledge the anti-racist. Sorry, I'll start that sentence again. I think it's important to acknowledge that we all have work to do when it comes to being anti-racist. It's a journey. It's not a destination you arrive at, and that we can all be racist irrespective of the color of our skin.
Right.
B, find a niche. Number two, find a niche, because it can be overwhelming and it's hard to be effective if you're trying to do everything. And C, do the work, get educated, because there's so many resources there. So many people think, oh, I'm going to do something about it, and as though the idea started with them. For generations, there have been thinkers doing work in this area. And so just spend the time to get educated.
Fantastic. I'm going to take it away from the book a little bit to another facet of you, where you're an ambassador for Gidget Foundation, which is a parents' mental health organization. You have gone public talking about postnatal depression. So your message, I think, to parents who are struggling with it together, because it's both parents going through it. What would you like to say to them? What would you like to say to them in terms of coping mechanism, or accepting it and moving forward?
The first thing I'd like to say is something that was said to me when I called a mental health helpline in absolute dire straits, not thinking I could get through the day. I remember hearing the counsellor on the phone tell me, this is not your fault. You didn't ask for this, and nothing you did made this happen to you. And I think just hearing that it wasn't my fault, that I wasn't alone, that I wasn't a bad parent, that somehow inadvertently caused this, it was just so comforting to hear that. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is to surround yourself with people who support you and understand and will listen. One of the extra complexities I faced navigating postnatal depression was some of the, as well as generational cultural divide between, say, my parents and my aunts and uncles and their attitudes towards mental illness, right, compared to my generation. So much of it was tied in a culture of sort of shame, or where, like similar to Indian culture with Lebanese culture, family is supreme. Having large families, it's something to be enjoyed and embraced, and we have extended family, all raising children and all involved in the parenting process. That can be really difficult and alienating if those people in your village are telling you it's shameful to speak like that, or discouraging you from getting help, or telling you to pray instead of seeking Western medicine or Western interventions. And so in speaking out about my struggle with mental illness, so much of it was because there is already a stigma just generally, and I think there's an added cultural stigma that I certainly found in Middle Eastern communities. And when I shared my story, so many Indian women then came forward and said, I am dealing with a similar thing, or I live with my mother-in-law, and I understand how much input, and and for some Western cultures it'd be seen as meddling, but input extended families and in-laws have in your everyday life and in your relationship. And that can be really burdensome and really problematic if you're struggling with mental illness and you're told that, oh, you're just having a bad day, or to toughen up, or just, if you just pray, you'll be okay. And so, and that's why I've tried to use my experience to shed a light on that added layer of cultural expectation that can make mental illness so much harder to deal with.
Right. There's also you being the ambassador for the Australian Thyroid Foundation, and hashtag asking for a friend on those lousy days, and this one's for you, Z. I know you're listening. What is your coping mechanism?
For dealing with thyroid disease?
Yeah, so thyroid disease, correct.
Yeah. And so I had a very strange experience where I didn't even realize I had a problem, but I was on air and there was a large lump on my throat, which I had never recognized. The makeup artist had it, my husband, nobody realized. A grandmother from regional Victoria messaged the network and said, I think Antoinette should check her thyroid out. And then when I looked back over the tapes, there was this enormous lump on my throat that I didn't even know was there. So I immediately got it checked out, and I found out I had an autoimmune disease and I had a large cyst on my thyroid. I've since had surgery to remove it. And then I realized there were so many other aspects of my life, the tiredness, some bowel disturbances. There were so many other things linked to my thyroid that I just kind of dismissed. And I think a lot of people minimize all of those little symptoms, but when you add them together, thyroid disease or issues and illnesses linked to thyroid can really impact your quality of life. So some tips. What do? I've drastically changed my diet. I know a lot of people don't want to hear this, but I don't eat dairy, I don't eat gluten. I take a whole heap of supplements. I have to ensure I get a lot of sleep. I need more sleep than other people. But they're the main two changes I've made. Centering sleep, cutting out gluten and dairy. And unfortunately, I just have to, it's my autoimmune disease is progressive. So I'll have it for the rest of my life. And I'll just have to continue managing it.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for that. Now, what's the Australia that you'd like to see your daughters grow up in?
Oh gosh, the Australia I'd like to see my daughters grow up in is able to reconcile its brutal racist colonial past, rather than continue to deny it. It's able to accept and reconcile it and ensure that we strive to a fairer and more inclusive society. We have so much to celebrate in Australia, but we are continually held back by our denial to and our refusal to right the wrongs of our past. Mm-hmm. And as we become a minority country, we need to see people like myself and yourself in politics, on board, in the Supreme Court, in positions of power, mm-hmm. in media, because it's not until we all have full and equal access to power that we can truly call ourselves a thriving democratic country.
Yeah. I mean, so this is not just an Australian story. As migration increases manifold across the world is shrinking. Borders are being crossed by millions in search of better lives. We all hope to end up in, a rainbow nation at peace with itself and the world, to quote Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And here's hoping that, Australia will be galloping along and getting to that destination soon enough. As we wrap up, well, I'd love for you to read a little, piece or passage from the book.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I'm going to go to the last chapter, because the last chapter talks about when you're doing work in social justice courses, it's really easy to feel overwhelmed and to sometimes to feel so angry at injustices or people who perpetuate racial violence or other forms of violence. And this last chapter is called Taking on the Haters Without Becoming a Hater. How do you ensure that while you do this work, you don't emulate the very behavior that you're trying to challenge?
Right.
And so I have a little, I have an exploration of how we can do this. So another strategy worth considering when challenging race-based hate and discrimination is to pause on and reflect on the wins, no matter how small, because changes to policy and power take time, and enduring change may take several lifetimes. Despite this, progress has been made in some areas. In terms of media representation and inclusion, since I began my advocacy several years ago, sections of the commercial media that used to be shut off to change have now made significant appointments of Indigenous journalists and other people of colour. So even incremental wins are worth noting. Things like journalists of colour telling me that since Media Diversity Australia launched, they are now more comfortable bringing their whole identity to the newsroom, rather than trying to hide things like their faith, ancestry, and non-English language skills. And I'm just going to skip to the end.
Yeah.
I've got a little recipe for helping endurance in this long game of influence. Consider it a protein shake for advocacy. 1 generous scoop of measured optimism. 3 heaped tablespoons of evidence-based advocacy methods. 2 cups of community support. 1/2 cup of self-reflection and growth. 100 grams of self-care, and a pinch of humour. We can hope, we can plan, we can try, we can be defeated. We cry, we reset. We can recognise a small win. We can laugh and then do it all again. And yes, it may feel like a never-ending merry-go-round that at times makes you nauseous. The journey will stop and start again. And at these junctures, you may need to let some friends and family go. They will get off the ride because they can't or don't want to stomach witnessing the faulty gears being forced to shift. But fear not, this rotating circular platform has seats for new riders who'll be inspired to join you on this journey towards a better, fairer, and more inclusive society.
Fantastic. Well, looking forward to having you in Mumbai City and you enjoying the country. Make sure you dabble in the cuisine. You'll have some fantastic conversations, that's for sure. So looking forward to having you in India. And thank you so much for joining me on 94.3 Radio 1.
Thank you so much for your time.
94.3 One World, your station. Radio 1.